Hi, I'm Susan Erdy. I'm the librarian here at the Maine Irish Heritage Center. We are very lucky to have with us today Michael Hogan, author of Women of the Irish Rising, A People's History. Dr. Hogan is the author of 26 books, including The Irish Soldiers of Mexico. He is a second-generation Irish American and has worked extensively in Ireland with the Mexican Embassy. Welcome, Dr. Hogan.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Susan. It's very special for me to be here to present today to the Maine Irish Heritage Center with its long and illustrious tradition. My topic today is Women of the Irish Rising, A People's History. Although there are many Irish connections with the U.S. and Canada and Mexico, and over 35 million people in North America claim Irish descent, most of us really know little about that nation's history. And if you're like me, before I began this research, probably know even less about the women who fought for Irish independence and what we might learn from them. So settle back this morning and I will share with you some of the stories that I discovered over the past 3 years, researching in the Irish military archives, reading women's journals, and eyewitness testimonies from the early 20th century. 1916 was a famous year. It was, as Charles Dickens would say, the best of times and the worst of times for the Irish. The liberal British government had finally, after 300 years of tyranny, considered offering home rule to Ireland, making it, like Canada, a self-governing part of the British Commonwealth, instead of an exploited colonial possession. The problem was that many English settlers in the North refused to accept that, as did most of their conservative sympathizers in the Parliament. When British officers stationed in the North threatened mutiny, and civilians imported thousands of rifles and millions of rounds of ammunition, the Home Rule Bill was in jeopardy. Meanwhile, World War I, the war to make the world safe for democracy, had begun, and Britain needed the Irish soldiers who were enlisting. So freedom for the Irish people would have to wait. But the leaders of the Irish Republican movement knew that once withdrawn, the offer for home rule would likely not come again. So they decided to act. The problem was they had no weapons to confront the British Army's machine guns and cannons, never mind the Mauser rifles of the Ulster Volunteers in the North. Fortunately, a woman appeared who would solve this problem. Her name was Molly Childers. Now, Molly grew up in Beacon Hill in Boston. Her family came over on the Mayflower and they were quite wealthy. But as a young girl, she suffered a skating accident and was permanently crippled. After months in bed, she was finally able to walk again, but with a limp. No longer able to play sports, her father interested her in sailing and she became adept at it. One day when she was at home, a British officer on leave was touring New England and came by her house. His motorcycle had broken down and he needed to borrow a spanner, or as we Americans say, a wrench. He introduced himself and the family invited him to dinner. He too had a limp. His came as a result of a wound from his service in the Boer War, and he too loved sailing. He and Molly hit it off. He was very sympathetic to the Irish since he had served with them in South Africa and also saw how they were being abused and held in contempt by British commanders. Molly, for her part, had seen the prejudice and abuse of Irish workers in Boston. And when they heard of the problems now in Ireland, they were sympathetic. To make a long story short, they fell in love, got married, and Molly's father blessed them by giving them a 51-foot sailing yacht named the Asgard as a wedding present. When they returned to Europe and learned more about the dilemma of the Irish nationalists, they decided to help. They raised several £1,000s and approached the Belgian intermediary to purchase rifles from Germany. Pretending that the rifles were for Mexican insurgents, who were then now in their own war, the famous Mexican Revolution, they purchased 900 rifles and 29,000 rounds of ammunition, loaded them aboard the yacht, and headed for Ireland. The crew consisted of Molly, her best friend Mary Rice, a deckhand, and her husband Erskine Childers. Molly was the captain. Now the problem, of course, was that on a 51-foot yacht, there was not room below for that many crates of rifles and ammunition, so some remained on deck. And before long, they encountered a British destroyer fleet. Hurriedly, she had the men cover the ammunition crates with cushions and folded sailcloths, and turned over the helm to her husband, while she and her friend perched on top in their bathing suits, distracting the sailors manning the deck guns which passed above them. If they were stopped, it could have been the death penalty, or at very least a lengthy prison term for treason and contributing to armed insurrection. So here's one of the first women, without whom there would have been no Irish Rising at all. The fighting began on Easter Monday, April 24th, 1916, when the first group took over the General Post Office as headquarters, and another 1,500 or so took up armed position in and around central Dublin and blockaded the streets. Now, it might be supposed that the rest of the 300 women involved played subsidiary roles, carrying messages or working as nurses or cooks. Well, some did those things, but others were armed combatants as well. A memorable one was Margaret Schneider. Born in a Glasgow ghetto to Irish parents who had immigrated to Scotland, she was sympathetic to the Irish workers who were her neighbors. She got a college degree and worked as a mathematics teacher. She joined a women's defense league, ironically, to defend Scotland against Germany in World War I. She learned how to handle explosives, how to shoot. But when she heard of the troubles in Ireland, she felt her loyalties lay there and immigrated. In Dublin, she joined the Irish Citizens' Army and used her sharpshooting skills against British soldiers. She also used her munitions training to set explosives to destroy British machine guns. On one such mission, she was shot 3 times, but survived. Among the many women who worked as combat medics, there was also one certified physician. Trained in England with an internship in the U.S., Dr. Kathleen Lynn not only provided her medical services, but trained many of the combat nurses. After the revolution, she would become the first woman to open her hospital for the treatment of poor children in Ireland. She would also lead Europe in establishing the first program of smallpox vaccinations. It might be supposed that this was a workers' revolution, since they were the most oppressed, and that most revolutions are from the lower classes, or that most were Catholic. In fact, there were women of all classes, Catholics and Protestants, many socialist, anti-clerical agnostics who joined together to fight for Irish independence, and at least one from the upper classes. Constance Markovich, a wealthy noblewoman and part of the ascendancy, turned her estate into a training school for young rebels. She sold her jewels to buy weapons and worked as a deputy battalion commander, wielding a Mauser machine gun pistol and commanding several young men. When finally captured by the British, she was sentenced to death for her part in the rising. Another key woman was Nellie Gifford. She was the provisioner for the rebel troops, which involved raiding British storehouses, confiscating produce and meat from markets, and supplying the rebel troops with food to sustain them during the week-long combat. Her sister Grace was in love with another insurgent, Joseph Plunkett, a well-known poet. When he was captured and sentenced to death, they married in the jail 2 hours before he faced the firing squad. The song Grace, which commemorates this sad event, is sung by Rod Stewart on YouTube. and worth listening to later on in the day when you have a chance. Grace. The rising ended in defeat for the Irish rebels. No matter how many rifles they had, they could not compete with the British machine guns, the artillery which destroyed buildings, the naval cannons firing from a gunboat on the Liffey River, nor the British reinforcements which outnumbered them 6-1. Much of downtown Dublin was destroyed. Many were killed, including civilians. Over 3,000 men were captured and many executed by firing squad. Over 70 women were imprisoned and one sentenced to death. But as the executions continued day after day, from May 3rd to August 3rd, public opinion turned against Great Britain. The reprisal seemed barbaric and motivated more by prejudice and hate than justice. Giving in finally to public opinion, Countess Markovich's death sentence was commuted to imprisonment by the Army Command. But the damage to Britain's reputation abroad was considerable. Besides the execution of 3 innocents early in the conflict, including a well-known pacifist, the death by firing squad of James Connolly, a beloved leader, was especially horrendous. Dying already of 2 gunshot wounds which had become gangrenous, he was nevertheless tied to a chair and placed before the firing squad and shot to death in the Kilmainham jail. Even the British soldiers in the firing squad were repulsed. His daughter, Nora Connolly, would escape and travel to Boston, where she regaled Irish-American crowds with the bloody details of the British reprisals and was able to raise over $100,000 to support the Sinn Féin independence movement, which would continue, this time as a guerrilla war. The British, their reputation already suffering as news of the concentration camps in South Africa became common knowledge, and concerned with new labor protest movements at home, ultimately would relent and give in to world opinion. The Irish would yet see their independence become a reality, despite their defeat in combat. For the women who had suffered so much, the freedom they had envisioned would not come easily. It was not until 1948 that their combat records were included in the military archives, where an alert officer noted that many of the veterans of the Rising were dying off. They were invited to Army headquarters to record their oral histories, and it is from these records that I derive many of the narratives that appear in my book, Women of the Irish Rising, A People's History. Some of them accomplished a great deal after the Rising was put down. After serving their prison sentences, many went on to have brilliant careers. Dr. Kathleen Lynn opened her famous hospital, the first hospital administered totally by women, and became a major force for curing contagious diseases among children. Constance Markovich was elected first to the British Parliament, and then, after the Republic was established, became an Irish senator. Margaret Schneider became a popular mathematics teacher in Dublin and was elected president of the National Teachers Union. Nellie Gifford became a broadcast journalist and the unofficial historian of the Easter Rising. Most were disheartened, however, when the new Irish Constitution, promulgated by conservatives and heavily influenced by the Catholic Church, forbade not only abortion, but birth control, denied women the right to serve on juries or in public administrative positions, and forbade divorce. There would have to be another fight to secure these rights and to establish themselves on equal footing with men. But unable to buck the conservative legislature, they finally took to the streets and voted en masse for referendums, which overturned the restrictive provisions of the Constitution and secured those rights. Today, Ireland leads the world with women in administrative and government positions. It is the only country which has had back-to-back women presidents. It has more women CEOs than any other European nation. But more importantly, it leads the world in intersectional feminism, working not just to ensure opportunities for middle-class women, but to all women, regardless of social or economic status, including the newly arrived immigrants from war-torn nations. And now we return to the present. I would like to close with a few words of how I came to write this book. Many years ago, my daughter Melissa was attacked by an aggressive pit bull. She was 5 years old and living in Boulder, Colorado, an upscale and very safe neighborhood. Her mother was cooking dinner and keeping watch out the window while Melissa was playing in the backyard. Suddenly, a pit bull on the loose jumped the fence and attacked her. Before her mom could react and come to the rescue, the dog had savagely torn up the child's face. Throughout her youth and adolescence, Melissa would go through 30 painful facial surgeries. She would be mocked by other kids for her deformity, and she would suffer both physically and psychologically. But she came through all those years with her pride, her courage, her sense of herself intact. She went to the University of Ireland, spent her junior year abroad. She went to the University of Colorado, rather, spent her junior year abroad in Ireland, studying at Trinity University and working with both Catholic and Protestant women during the bloody conflict between the British-dominated and Protestant North and the independent and largely Catholic South. She graduated with honors, and her honors thesis was on the possibility of peace in the region if only women on both sides could come together. She put together a proposal for action and worked as a volunteer, organizing reunions between mothers and wives on both sides. In 1998, she was hired by former President Bill Clinton to work with him on the Irish Peace Treaty. It was with him when the Central Unionist Party of Ulster in the north and the Labour Party and Sinn Féin in the south signed the Good Friday Agreement, bringing peace to the region. So this book is a tribute to her as well, and to all the women who have suffered and triumphed, who have come through pain and even horror, not only to make something of themselves, but to serve the larger community. My thanks to all of you for attending this talk today. I hope you will read the book. I think you will enjoy it. And if you hang around, I'll be glad to answer any questions you have about this history.
Thank you. That was a very interesting talk. We appreciate it. Just have a couple of quick questions. Did you have a favorite woman of all the women you wrote about?
Yes, so one of my favorites was Molly Childers, who brought the Ascot, the ship, from Germany over to Ireland with all the guns abroad, and I think that was a very brave and really almost foolhardy thing to do, and especially when she passed through the British destroyers. I mean, that was just amazing. And of course, her husband, who was a British soldier, retired British soldier, faced the death penalty, and she, of course, faced life imprisonment. So, incredibly brave and dangerous, and that was a great story.
Is one of the stories you'd like to see expanded upon, maybe made longer?
Well, that one, which struck several people, including a screenwriter by the name of R.C. Bromthal. And R.C. said, well, if you would write me a treatment of that story, I would be glad to put together a screenplay and submit it to my agent to make a movie of it. So I'm kind of excited about that. I just finished the treatment about a month ago.
Wow, that'd be very exciting, definitely. I think it would make a great movie.
Yeah, she was a Bostonian, so it brings it back to New England and shows the New England connection between the Rising and the women who were involved as well.
Yeah, so true, so very true. You touched on a little bit, but I was going to ask you more about the state of women's rights in Ireland at the time and after.
Well, this was like the high point of women's rights and participation. The Rising, and interestingly enough, although it was only 1916, there were several feminists who were actually men and leaders in the movement, including James Connolly.
Hmm.
who wrote several different things about feminism and women's rights and women's equal participation in all affairs.
Hmm.
But of course, he was killed by the
Right.
British, and so were several others who were equally, involved in advancing women's rights. And those that followed were conservatives, including Eamon de Valera,
Hmm.
who was in cahoots with the Catholic bishop at the time, John McQuaid, who was very, very conservative. And they lived on the same street. I would say he was reactionary, as Catholics go.
Right.
And they lived on the same street in Ireland, an upscale neighborhood. And his son went to the school that McQuaid had previously been a teacher at when he was a young priest. So McQuaid was in and out of De Valera's house the whole time they were writing the Constitution and putting in things like women's places in the home, and women should not be involved in politics, and birth control is against God's will, and so on and so forth. And these things ended up in the Constitution. So it took a long time for women to finally get back to the point where they were in 1916. It wasn't until maybe 1960 or so that began to happen. And it happened because women took to the streets, and
Hmm.
they passed referendums which undid those conservative elements in the Constitution. And of course, joining the European Union helped as well.
Hmm. Very true. Very interesting. When you were doing your research, did it surprise you how many of the women were active combatants?
It really did. It really did. And I think one of the things that happened was when I began to write about it, discuss with other people, they were amazed as well. And there was only one woman I found who was really, active in promoting that idea. She was an archivist in Dublin. Her name was Sinead McCool, and Sinead had actually put together an exhibition called Mana, M-N-A, accent on the A, which means women, which is about the women of 1916. And she and I ultimately presented together just about 6 months ago in Mexico City, where she discussed her exhibition and my book.
Very cool. Is there another area of Irish history you would like to write about?
Well, I don't know. I think one of the really interesting things in an earlier book was the Irish soldiers of
Mhm.
Mexico.
Right.
Many people were unaware that the San Patricio Battalion, or the St. Patrick's Battalion, came to the aid of Mexico in 1846 to 48. And there's many Mexican Irish here in Mexico. So that's an important part of history as well. The other part of Irish history, I guess, but there's been so much written about it, is that of the 1960s and ultimately leading up to the peace treaty. And
Hmm.
my daughter is very has published articles and so on about that. So I'll leave that to her generation.
Fair enough. Well, thank you. This has been absolutely amazing. The book is terrific. I hope if people haven't read it, they're going to get a chance to read it. And we really appreciate you coming and speaking with us today about this amazing chapter of history. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susan, and thanks to Jean for uh,
Yes,
her unlocking our technical difficulties.
she's amazing, definitely.
She
Thank you
is.
so much.
Bye bye.
Bye now.